Okay. Now, some of the people that have heard these tapes and coming to the house, in the last year or so, I've been talking about an anthropological entry into the Chumash text.
A what entry?
Anthropological.
Anthropological.
And a number of people ask, what exactly is that? What are you talking about, an anthropological entry? So this evening I want to clarify a little bit, because it's a big, big topic. I want to clarify a little bit the characteristics of what I'm calling this anthropological entry. And at the end, I'll show you an exemplification of that in the discussion of the man in the midbar. So I'm going to keep to the end the discussion of the man. But I'll give you enough to get started so that we can work together and see how what I'm talking about is exemplified in the man. Now, it turns out it's exemplified in 100, 200, 300 places. It's not just the man. I just happened to be preparing when we had the parsha of the man, so I decided to talk about the man. But you could take any piece at random in the Chumash text and enter anthropological.
Can we have a definition of anthropology?
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. Not definition, but understand what's going on. Okay. Now, the existing entry into the text to understand the Chumash, wherever it came from, it's basically metaphysical, ethical. In other words, the Greek understanding of the world, of nature, the Greek understanding of history, whatever, the Greek understanding somehow permeated the understanding of the text. There was a prehistory by the prophets and by Chazal, but what remained, and that's not for tonight at all, what remained has been a metaphysical, ethical interpretation of the text. Meaning that one has to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and understand the mitzvot system and practice it, and that is the message of the text. As you'll see tonight, for example, what is this man about? The text talks about Shabbat. You'll see in the text, if you recall, the text talks about Shabbat. Namely, that you couldn't gather it except each day. And the moral of the story is, both in Shmo and Bamidbar, the moral of the story is that a person is born to relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the mitzvot. And therefore there's a lot of metaphysical interpretation in the text that has to do with existence of God, His characteristics. And then there's a tremendous amount of material in the domain of what we call the ethical. And it hasn't been called ethical monotheism for nothing. I mean, that's how it's come down. You ask somebody, not even uneducated, that's how it's come down. It's ethical monotheism. Okay. Now, an anthropological entry into the text is going to replace this orientation. How are we going to do that? First, in the ancient world, in antiquity, and we are late when it comes to antiquity. We came into the scene 6,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution took place back 10 to 12,000 BC. And so, realize, the first move is, to enter anthropologically is, you must think in long time scales. 10,000 years. You know what 10,000 years? You just think it's just a number. 10,000 years. It's 300 years since Newton and the scientific revolution. Okay? 300 years. How many times? 300 times 30. Right? 300 times 30 gives you 9,000, 10,000 years. So it's 300 times more. First thing to understand is you must enter with a wide time scale. And further, you've got to realize that I'm just talking about when I learned Chumash and learned in general, I had a very truncated view of the ancient world. I took it for granted they were like there were settlements, and there were people, and then there was wide open spaces. Not true at all. Not true at all. There were kingships that spanned east and west, north and south. There were distances that were covered that are staggering. There were kingships, wars, natural occurrences of plagues and so on and so on that took centuries for them to come to fruition. There were things that were going on that were not in awareness. They didn't register in the awareness of the people, but they were going on until some point where either they got lost, they dissolved out, or they became recognized. Now these are assumptions. I always say, what do you mean not recognized? What do you mean? Something is working and it's not registered in your head what's going on? What do you mean? So I said, Greg, in addition to feeding, look at the child. Look at the child from birth to 3 years old. And what do we have? If we say one day is 1,000 years, just forget about Chazal, but 1 day is 1,000 years. So we have 10,000 years being represented in the first 3 years of the child. Why is that important? Because in the child, it's exactly the same thing. The child doesn't operate with awareness. Awareness is a learning experience that comes later, after other experiences where they're like preparing the way. We would say preparing the way, but they're functioning, but the child has to learn everything. The child has to learn that if he touches too hard, he's going to get hit back by his brother. That's a learning experience. It may take 2 years to learn that, or to become aware of the thing. And so, the first beginning to enter anthropologically is to do the kind of a work that an anthropologist does. He's sensitive to these kinds of things. For example, a very poignant example is there were kingships, and there was a kingship that dominated the whole area, okay, from coast to coast, from north to south, and they did not recognize in awareness conjugal relations. Now you could say that that's impossible. You say no, the human being has a brain, is born with sexual organs and other things, and what do you mean he's not aware? What do you mean he's not aware? He's not aware. So for over 3,000 years, in this particular kingship, which was dominating the whole universe at the time, there was no awareness of conjugal relations. Now, you say that's crazy. Well, for us, of course, we're far away from that whole world. But that's the fact. So an anthropologist, when he looks at a text, he looks at a culture, he comes in with this wide framework, he comes in with this whole picture, and he's very sensitive to things that are going on but are not being registered by the mind, or by the feeling, or by the action of the person.
I mean, sexual relations dafka? And, I mean, what about eating? I mean,
Exactly.
just everything. There was no
Well,
awareness of...
Greg,
Yeah.
eating, of course. You know how much work is going into a baby learning how to eat
Yeah.
and how to talk and how to walk.
You're saying the first 3 years there's no...
and
I don't
after,
understand. I don't
and
understand.
after.
No,
but
I'm talking about, ancient civilizations
yeah,
having no awareness of sexuality. That needs...
that can go for thousands of years.
Yeah, but that needs explanation. What that...
Why? What has to be explained? Tell me what
They
has
never
to be
saw
explained.
animals?
What has to be
They never
explained?
saw farm animals?
You're asking good. What has to be explained?
What does awareness mean? Does it mean reflecting on abstractly? Like what?
No.
What does it mean?
It means
Like
that
if you thought back 2 hours ago, you remember that you had sex, or
that's already late. When you talk about now memory, you talk about in the mind, and so on.
are you
These are
thinking
different
about
layers.
I want to?
Whatever.
Like, what do you
or
mean
let's
about-
put it this way. Let's put it this. Take an operational definition. In sensations, in senses. Okay. Today you touch the person. You touch the woman's hand. Okay. Tomorrow you touch the woman's hand, but you feel different. You feel different. You don't feel the same. Okay? Now, multiply that concerning every single item, including sexuality, and you have what can be called an anthropological entry into how to understand the sexual relation. It may, in other words, giving you a strict operational definition. It feels different. Okay? It takes on an awareness, a feeling. And then it feels different. And then it's connected to an action. And then and on and on and on and on and on. And the closest analogy that we have to understand or enter this anthropological framework is the child from age, birth, conception to the age 3. Berech. Because if you think about it, what's going on every moment, right? The day is now broken up into hours, and some things take days, some things take weeks, to even come near what the adult thinks. Indeed, as the parent knows, you got to learn. You, as the grandparent, we got to learn, right? We have to learn how the child is processing things. What looks to us like, oh, don't hit him, you'll hurt him, doesn't exist in the child's world until a development moves in these big, big steps. So that's what I mean as first entry into anthropological orientation. Anthropological is trying to capture these movements. So I'm breaking down the myths that have come down to us in Western civilization about antiquity. They, in the main, have come from the Greece and the impact of Greek thought in the world. And so it was good to talk about or understand and differentiate the Greek line, which was thinking, which was high level feeling, high level thinking, to differentiate it from a beginning point that, quote, was chaos, lacked order, it was just a no-man land, exemplified by these kingships and so on. When you look at the anthropological material, you see that it's absolutely a myth. It's absolutely false. They had technology, they had workables, they had all kinds of things that were part and made up the civilization. Indeed, there was more cross-culture in the ancient antiquity world than there is today. In other words, as civilization developed, we moved away from big things like that. And we started to get into groups, and into peoples, and into nations. What do you know? When Roni came into the family, they gave me a book on Chalad. Did I know? What do I know about the Sephardi world? Nothing. So not to be an Amaretz, I read a few books, Kol HaKavod. But that's that's the story. Okay, so this is the first beginning point. While I'm on this, I talked about the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution seems to be the consensus of opinion, anthropological opinion, that this began 10 to 12,000 years ago. I put it after the meltdown of the Ice Age. There were a number of meltdowns, and during that time there were still what we call transition to human people. There was the hominoid, and there was this, and there were different stages in the evolution. And the human being, as we know it, emerged more or less in the agricultural revolution. Now, the term agricultural revolution, when did it come in? We characterized the period, but nobody in 10,000 BCE said agricultural revolution. Things were functioning that when we look at it, in order to explain it or to give a label to it, we say agricultural revolution. And it involved livestock and this and that and all the rest of the components. Okay. This was coined in the 19th century. The word, I'm not a Google man, but sometimes they just give you a little one-line information, which is okay. And so I looked it up for tonight's talk. So here it was. This was somebody in the 19th century doing anthropology and writing up the development after the Industrial Revolution, contrasted the Industrial Revolution with the Agricultural Revolution that was still going on in Europe and other places in the 19th century. One of the characteristics of anthropology is capturing origins and seeing how they unfold in different periods, with different people, with changes. A tsunami hits the world, bingo, it changes all kinds of things. A comet hits the planet, it wipes out civilizations. Most of the people, when it comes to Atlantis, agree that there was a continent called Atlantis. And it went under and sunk, and it took years. Years doesn't mean 10 years. Years now doesn't mean 100 years. Years is measured in millennia, not centuries. It took centuries, millennia, for the impact, the ecological impact of the submerging of Atlantis. And people, human beings were here, like I'm saying, and they had to relate now to something that was a staggering thing. Now, when it became aware to connect something going on with another thing going on was a learning experience. If they had to learn about conjugal relation, entering awareness, Kal v'choma, certainly they had to learn about how an ecological factor affects my house. All of this is part of the anthropological world. Okay. So, what I was saying was that the term agricultural revolution is a 19th century term. Okay? And has nothing to do with what they were aware of, how much connections between agriculture and life were made, and so on, so on, so on. That's all part of the research that an anthropologist does when he's examining a culture. Okay, but what's the point? The point I want to make is the following. There came a time during that 10,000 year period, 10,000 years, 10,000 years we're talking about, 10,000 years. The library over here, this is 300 years. It's from Newton. Oh, we have a little Plato and Aristotle, so we're talking here about 1,000 years. Okay, that's it, maximum. So, agricultural revolution was coined in the 19th century. Why? Because the people who were writing and trying to explain civilization, what was dominant in their head was contrast with the Industrial Revolution and seeing whether it's still going on, which is a very reasonable discussion. Okay. But, interestingly enough, there came a time during this 10,000 year period when it dawned on kings, it dawned on leadership, on people. We had empires. Even kingship is misleading because we think of Europe. Europe is late on the scene. Whoa, about kingship and legal systems and all of it. Oh my God. We're far and far away from all of that. There were empires that spanned the continent, spanned the globe. So, at a certain point, something emerged that soon became cross-cultural in all the different empires. What was it? That the living generation should preserve the things that were done in the past and pass them on so that somebody else can benefit. That does not come in 5 minutes. It took 4,000 or 5,000 years. Again, we're talking big time scales. If you don't keep that in the back of your head like a mantra, you're going to get, you say, well, as I talk, the more shtuyot. Because you'll keep on putting things into a contemporary framework or a recent historical framework and bypass what I'm trying to get at. So, agricultural revolution, the term, came in the 19th century. Because the 19th century had certain characteristics. Okay? I'm writing in the 20th century, 21st century. It has certain characteristics, never mind what they are. So I said, wait a minute. The encyclopedia talks about the Stone Age, right? The agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. That's in all your anthropology books. Well, that may have been good for 1950 or for 1850. It's not good for me because I'm interested in something else. I'm interested in knowledge, in the transmission of things that worked. I'm interested in science. So from a science point of view, yours truly, Joe Levinson, added a BIMCOM. Instead of talking about agricultural revolution and Bronze Age, Iron Age, I said there was something there in the middle called the tradition revolution. Here's a label. Now, contemporary anthropologists, when understanding the stages and trying to give labels, will say, oh yeah, that's great. I mean, that's fantastic. It took so many thousands of years to dawn on the leadership on kings and so forth that they should organize and preserve what they were doing, how they conquered, how they fought, how they did everything, to pass it on to the future generations. That's a learning experience, but to me that resonates. The agricultural revolution resonates up here in the head. Of course, we wouldn't be here without agricultural revolution, we wouldn't have food and blah, 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 blah. However, what resonates for me about the ancient world is these workables, these things that were there, and at a certain time became fundamental to being passed on. That was something that emerged over a period of time, and one of the things that stuck was this. And so, you know where I'm going. And so, when we deal with the ancient Near Eastern text, ANET, called 5 Books of Moses, we're already coming in 7,000 BC. We're coming after. We're inheriting this whole 10,000 year development of civilization, and included in what Moses got was the continuance of workables, of things that came from way back in antiquity. But we're following out this thing of consciousness that, and enter the awareness that it should be passed on. And so, things, workables, thoughts, feelings, actions, to take the main three classes, thoughts, feelings, actions, got passed on. Different kinds of thoughts, different subject matters, whatever they had, different feelings, different actions, different makings. And so, these things got passed on, and when it came to a next generation, like Moshe, writing down, and I'm not entering anything here of biblical criticism, it's all irrelevant to this point. What I'm saying is that when Moshe writes the text, in the text are vestiges, what I call vestiges of antiquity that went way back. And so, an anthropological entry into the Chumash text is to capture those vestiges that were in the text. So you could say, well, wait, what are you doing here? Who cares? What's the relevance? Oh yeah, for me and you read the Chumash every week as Torah people. Well, to get up shot on something or to see a vestige and give an interpretation that makes sense, I say that's great. It's great for me. When I make a chiddush on something, and I'm sure it was great for Rashi and Ramban and anybody else who took his hand at interpreting the Chumash, writing a commentary. In other words, there was this feeling of getting something that has been bypassed. Because what happened? Why does it come across as such a chiddush? You'll hear me talk later on at the end about the man and give you a shot what it means, and then you can say, well, I'm reading the Parsha for 50 years. More than 50. But nobody ever taught me that the text is chock full of vestiges from the antiquity and ancient world. So I say, the main question, what is the relevance? For me and you, that is a relevance. If that's part of our lives every week, and we read the Parsha, and we get upshatel, upshat, and we get hear a drash, and so on, and we can differentiate between drush and drash, and show a certain profundity in the words, in the material, well, you walk away with a good feeling. I do. Walk away with a good feeling that you gain something in your study of the text. Well, who is that? In civilization today, that's nothing. Who is that? No, nothing. A drop in the bucket of a tremendous bucket of called Western civilization, and Jewishness and Judaism is a little globule on the tip of the keli, of the vessel. Okay, so what's the relevance? Except for that group of people, which is us, it has no relevance. Yeah, if you're an anthropologist, sure. If you have to give lectures, sure. If you have to, that's your job, that's your work, fine. You're a high school teacher, you're working in curriculum. If your job involves that, fine, of course. It goes without saying. You can't teach philosophy if you don't study it. I mean, you can't just make up the world. So you have to study, and you have to read, and you have to do all these things. Okay. So, aside from people whose work requires it, and the very, very small handful of Torah people who still see the Chumash world, the Chumash text, ancient Near Eastern text, and the prophets, together with Chazal and the Gemara and the Jewish great Jewish legal system, which, as you know, I heard from you heard it plenty of times. I consider the Talmud to be one of the greatest contributions of human intellection. Had nothing to do with religion, just the corpus, the Mishnah, the Braito, the Gemara, systematic, which spread over 600 years, was to me, a fantastic, unbelievable accomplishment. Certainly, for me, in the world of the humanities, no less significant than Newton and the scientific revolution. Okay, So who are we relevant? What's the relevance? What's the relevance? Aside from these small groups, what's the relevance on a world scene? Scene? The relevance is that the metaphysical, ethical interpretation of the ancient Near Eastern text is finished. It was good until Descartes and the scientific revolution. And the Rebbe Z, he said in one of his books, very strong words, it's all over. It's all over. Period. What was he talking about? He was saying the Rambam. When I came to him in New York, I knew he was great. I knew he was a good one. I knew I had to study with him. Because he said the Rambam is good. That's the word he used. The Rambam is good until Descartes. What? The Rambam is good until Descartes? What's he talking about? He's not talking about the halacha. Because in Brisk, you can't give a shir without... You can't give a Gemara shir without the Rambam. No Brisk shir begins with the Gemara, with the page. Every Brisk shir begins with a question in the Rambam. And then it moves to Reb Chaim HaLevi, answer to the question, and then Reb Baruch Beer, Leibovich, and the whole Shakuvataya of the Sugya. Okay, so Reb Chaim in strong words, you can read it for yourself, 168, whatever page it is in Torah and Reason. He said, once and for all time, it's finished. What he meant was, the Greek understanding and entry into the text in a metaphysical, ethical framework has had its day in the sun. And he used very strong language. Now, if you ask people, leaders today, what they say about that, well, since at the moment we don't have too much to replace it, let's stick to the great accomplishments of the Chazal, medieval Jewish philosophy, and so on. But when you think about it, it's all over. Science has become the paradigm of knowledge, of understanding, of knowledge. And so, by studying an ancient Near Eastern text with a metaphysical, ethical approach, nothing will come out for science. Nothing will come out for science. There may be something coming out for the nature of logic, for the nature of thought, but generally speaking, nothing will be valuable for the scientific industry, work, and its advance. But, why? Why? Because metaphysics is so much dealing with a specific type of a problem. What is the nature of being? That's the problem of metaphysics. To understand the idea, to understand what it is and what it's not, and so what has been every generation since the Greeks has had people struggling to understand aspects of this legacy, which has, in a certain sense, formed the basis of Western civilization. But it came to an end. It's over. Well, anthropological entry into the text is not over. It's first beginning. The famous example is the drug companies. Every single pharmaceutical company has a team of anthropologists on staff. What's anthropology got to do with making drugs? When they read something in an ancient Near Eastern text, or a text that went way before, and it looks like they're talking about some kind of a rash that looks like a cancer of certain thing on the skin, let's explore that. Let's go and explore. Maybe we'll learn something that we don't know. After all, anybody who works in the domain of life and of the life sciences, from one end to the other, knows the complexity, the tremendous complexity of every organ, system, and so forth in the human being. And so, instead of being complacent and saying, well, progress. We left the ancient world where it belongs, let it die in peace. It's not going to die, because the ideas and the workables that were done then, they have in them some parts, some pieces that will fit into modern science. And so I mentioned a number of times, and Freddie in particular, 50 years ago is not today. 50 years ago when I went to school, when Gene went to school, they said, everything begins with Homer, with the Greeks. Western civilization begins with the Greeks. And furthermore, everything before, clairvoyance, divination, reading tea leaves, palms, this, all kinds of things, are total superstition, and he who wastes his time reading them is absolutely out of touch, to say the least, out of touch with intellectual reality, with intellectual. In other words, he will not pass a science course. He will not pass a course in the university unless he says, look, I'm concerned with this, but I'm certainly not concerned with that. Oh yes. I remember, I said it once, when I took an anthropology course, they looked at my record when I got to Boston, and they said, oh, you didn't take an anthropology course. We're going to give you an anthropology course. I said, why do you bother me? I'm a philosophy man. What are you bothering? I said, right, couple of an anthropology course. So there was a guy named Whiting, who was a big contemporary 20th century anthropologist, and they put me in his course, and I'll never forget, it's a joke. I mean, maybe it's not a joke. I shouldn't give away secrets. But the point was, he gave an exam, a final exam, and I didn't read the text. I didn't read his book. He wrote a big book on anthropology. I didn't read all this kind of stuff. I only read a little bit on the nature of space and time. And when I got the exam, I said, oh my God, I don't know a thing. I don't know a thing. I can't answer this. Boaz and this guy and that, and about skulls and this and measurement and all kinds of things. I wrote back in my test booklet, I'm going to take these questions and answer them from the point of view of what I'm interested in. Which, don't do that as a general advice. You're not running the course. There's a professor up there, and you can get into trouble. But fortunately, he was a nice guy, and when he read my paper, the exam booklet, he called me in the office and he said, he says, you don't do things like that. But it was very interesting what you did. And what you did was enter the material that we were learning in an anthropological way and related things that resonated with me, who was interested in space and time. Okay? So I got an A, very good, because he was a nice guy. But the basic point was that 50 years ago, there was a category of intellection called superstition. Don't waste your time. Today, 50 years after, there is no such category. What I found in the last year of my studies of the ancient world, okay, from different angles, what I found was everything that in those days, 50 years ago, was labeled superstition, not to waste your time with, every single one, barring none, Freddie, barring none, every single one is now a topic by some kind of a research team in neurophysiology, chemistry, so on, so on, so on, so on. Everyone, everything. What's the point? It's not to go back. It's to say, maybe included in what this workable and that workable and this vestige and that vestige are things, are aspects that we in 20th century, 21st century Western civilization haven't thought about. And when we do think about them, we may find that we have to start to modify a little bit, and perhaps more than a little bit. We have to incorporate these things into a new paradigm of science, especially the health life sciences. And so now when you talk about relevance, It's directly relevant, not just to the people who teach it, not just to the people who study Chumash, but for the Western civilization per se. Just like a pharmaceutical company, if some anthropologist gets something and he gleans it and he works it out and he takes the biochemistry, well, the drug makes $5 million. Then it becomes a drug. Well, Western civilization's the pill, as I know from this business. It's the pill. So they make a pill. So what I'm saying in conclusion of this is, I introduced a new category that resonates with me and with any scientific person, namely the tradition revolution, which emerged in the middle somewhere of the agricultural revolution. And further, when you follow it through, it answers the question of relevance. I said numerous times, a guy was going to, this week he left for Germany to a conference. I ate there by Shabbat, for Shabbat. So he said he's going to Germany and he has a meeting with Arab leaders and German leaders and so forth. And he said, I don't know why he asked around the table if we had any messages to give. And he's going to meet some of these people. Now, I don't know if they were politicians or intellectuals. I don't know. You know, Arabs and Islam has a class of intellectuals, I hate to tell you. I mean, not everyone is a terrorist, but they fear for their lives. They can't go to conferences because they take it out on their families and so on. So there's a big problem here. But they're eggheads, and they want to have space and time and money to do research and stuff like that. Just like we, as Torah people or as researchers, want to get grants and postdoctorals and so on. So there is an intellectual class. I met them when there was a 90th birthday for the guy upstairs who passed away. He was an Arabist, and he invited me to his 90th birthday in Meyersdorf in Hebrew University. And I met a lot of interesting people there, though it's not the time to talk when you're in the middle of this course and that course and so on. Okay, so the relevance is there 100%. We may learn some things that we didn't know. I said, not in joking, but in serious, so I said, he asked me, you know, we were sitting around the table, so he asked me, what would you tell him? So I said, well, I would tell him that instead of putting all the money that's supporting politics and international relations and the Arab-Israeli situation, they should take a good percentage of it and put it into the research for life health sciences. Of course, he looked at me like I'm crazy out of left field. To say that today is utopia. I mean, to say that today is to bypass all the things that are going on, both sides, not only Arab side, both sides. And to me, it's a chil Hashem in spades. To have money, like when you read about poor people that are below the poverty line and people in Israel that are starving, well, how could that be? I mean, that's a top problem. We can't, how can you have people that have nothing to eat? That's the chil Hashem. But Torah is not clean that we can just say, okay, forget about everything else, we're going to put the money in there. A friend of mine, a colleague, worked for the National Bank. And he said, after 25 years of being an economist for the National Bank, I don't know what they call it, National Bank, what do they call it?
Bank of Israel.
No, not the bank. The National Bank, do they call it National Bank? A big umbrella organization that gets money and gives it to the poor people. World Bank. World Bank. So he said, after being an economist for 25, 30 years in this organization, he felt his life was wasted because the money never got down to the bottom. This was filtered off at this level, this was filtered off at this level, this was filtered off at this level, and then there was nothing left for the poor people. But he was supposed to be doing economics that related to giving to the poor. Okay, so I think I don't have to bang it home more. I wrote some beautiful things that came off the pen, just writing it up. Man, it's staggering. It just was on a cloud nine, just punching keys, you know. And what came out of some beautiful paragraphs, but I won't burden you to read them. The basic point was that relevance is absolutely the first order of these studies, of this entry. If you want to talk it in big terms, the light of Zion, from the Jewish point of view, the light of the Jewish point of view is, I won't say only and exclusively, but for the most part, exclusively creative advance in life, health, research, and applications, and technology. And even in Freud language in 1900, Freud, and you can criticize from now till today, his particular understanding of the life system and of psychoanalysis. And there were criticisms, and I criticized it as well. However, in the big brush point of view, he understood. He said, psychoanalysis is Judaism. Meaning that Judaism is concerned with the life system, which for Freud, unfortunately, had a narrow base and so on and so on and so on. But in principle, in the big picture, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. I won't talk about exclusive, but certainly, and for the most part, this is the Torah system. Okay, so relevance, we're finished. Relevant is right there. Okay, now to finish up for this evening, the month. Okay, so the man, like everything else, looks like, feels the music. It's a vestige of something that was in the past. Lo and behold, when you examine the 10,000 year period, you see there were kingships from one end to the other that talk about feeding people for a long period of time on something that looks like what the Chumash says is the man. More specifically, there were psychedelic substances, plants, okay, that had nutritional value. And these psychedelic plants, some reports come down in the anthropological literature that they were used as edibles for 50 years. So, what did they find out? They found out, when you read the description, Moshe didn't have to give a description of the man in two places, in the Chumash. He could have said the man, and it's an edible, okay? And Hashem put it in the universe at that time so that the Yisrael can eat and survive in the Midbar. What 40 years means is a separate issue, because the number 40 has a qualitative meaning in addition to a quantitative meaning. 40 years, you say, well, 40 years on the calendar. But the number 40 has many numbers in the Chumash text and in ancient Near Eastern texts in general, and in Antiquity texts in particular. Numbers were not only quantity, number, amounts. See? Numbers had a qualitative dimension. So it could have been that the number 40 meant as long as it takes to do the job. When Moshe went up on the mountain to write the second Luchot, it says 40 days and 40 nights. What does that say, 40 nights? 40 days means 24-hour days, right? Like we say, the calendar, 24 hours a day. It could be 40 men, this is just an aside, it could be 40 men, night and day. What we call night and day. A bitui, a metaphor. He worked around the clock. He worked 40 days and 40 nights. Meaning that 40, the number, may not be a part of a vestige, but another piece that was added. So Moshe Rabbeinu, when he's writing the text, includes in it a description. It was hard. You could only gather it and eat it on the day of one day at a time. And Therefore, you couldn't save it over for Shabbat. And when you look at the story is that you have to obey the Shabbat laws with respect to the man. Don't try to save it. Don't try to hoard it up. But keep the Shabbat, because the Shabbat is an all-important mitzvah in the Torah system. Wait a minute. We have to ask an anthropology person, what is that now? What is that? Is that Moshe's rewriting of something that was a vestige, which we'll talk about right away? Or, like in every generation, we rewrite and pick out things from the past. Like I gave you an example. I coined a new term about tradition revolution. Makes perfect sense, but it's coming from a new generation, a new set of things resonating in my head that are not resonating 50 years ago. So the question as an anthropologist is not to take it as face value, that the message is to keep the Shabbat, okay, at all costs. But to see, yes, that's there. It's right there in the text. But where's the vestige? Well, Moshe decided to incorporate into this little piece a description of the man. Okay? And it turns out that the description is that it's very hard in small pellets and so on and so on, and had to be ground in order to become an edible into a pancake-like. It had to be ground, and those things were like a pancake, and it was edible when you mixed it with certain liquids, but it was very on the ground. It had a bluish color, and it had very hard. Okay, so now let's say, is there something in antiquity that resonates with this description? That's anthropological. We're asking the anthropological question. We're bypassing the significance, but we're not throwing out what Moshe did. That's right in the text. He redid it in a new frame. A frame that was part of where he was, about the mitzvah of Shabbat and all the other mitzvah. But it turns out that whatever literature we have that's left over, or left from the ancient world, and we have some, not a lot, shows that there were similar descriptions of edibles in a society or part of a civilization that was 8,000 years before that. There was a kingship that nurtured its people on that. And so what are we finding? We're now finding an anthropological entry into the text which is going to lead to the conclusion, 100% conclusion, that Moshe was fulfilling or received this idea that came up in that period of saying everything that we do and did in the past is important, it should be passed on. All of a sudden that came into being at that time, and it was renewed in Moshe. And it was renewed in all the leaders and writers of the time since that end, during and the conclusion of that 10,000 year period. It was rewritten. But he opted, whether he was aware of it, whether he was intending to keep it in, or not intending to keep it in, the fact is it's in the book. It's in the book. In other words, it was hard. So what was it? It was psychedelic mushrooms. It's known that a number of species of mushrooms have psychedelic effects, never mind what that is and what it means and everything else. It's something. Whatever it is, it's something. It changes the feelings, gives certain visions. Whatever it is irrelevant for the moment. In the big picture, of course it's relevant. But, so what was shown was that it was mushrooms that dried out. And when they dried, the water content evaporated out, and what was left was pellets that were described in the text, which, when mixed with some kind of a liquid or water or whatever, was made into patties and heated up and was eaten as food. And so what do we see? we see that one connection is the real thing. I mean, whatever it was called, the separation will come right away, but the description matches the description in the text. That's an evidence to say, well, it's you got something there. But there were other ways of connecting. For example, a king was named Hermann. And he had a tremendous kingship that spanned the whole continent. And he was a king that achieved a kind of a tranquility in his time. Not everything was just continual war. Like the little child, just up, down, in, out, and so on. So it's not. So he, in his kingship, he used as part, for whatever purpose, psychedelic material that the description of which is similar to the one in the Chumash. So they called it Man, from his name Hermann. In other words, the giving of names is part of this learning, the package of learnings that's constituting the development of civilization. So it could be that the function of the thing to make a pancake was from one frame, from one vestige, and the name was from another vestige. In other words, I'll say by association. And this is the final point for this evening. The pattern of thinking, the character of thinking in the ancient Near Eastern text, in Moshe Rabbeinu, in the Choli, for the most part, in the entire world at the time, was associative. If this associated with this and that associated with this, there was something to it. Jung, the psychologist, the psychoanalyst, the Freud student, when he broke with Freud, he wrote a book on synchronicity, things happening at the same time. Okay? Could be far away. But the fact that they happen at the same time, maybe is telling us something that we don't know. That there's some kind of a mentality that transcends the way one we have, and blah, 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 blah. Which, 50 years ago, was stuyot. Don't waste your time. Not today. Every single thing that was clairvoyance and so forth is today part of research. Because we don't know where the blitz will come for the Einstein of biology. We've had great success since Newton in physics and its technology, in motion, in energy, thermodynamics, so forth. But as the problem of life, what is life? What is human life? Emerged, we ain't got nothing. We got almost zero. That's why we're going to the Orient to see workables that are under the category of health life. Maybe they could teach us something. Maybe we're missing so much in the West that we need a paradigm shift that the likelihood, the likes of which will be a light that just we wouldn't believe. We are in a dark age. When it comes to the life system and all of its dimensions, we have to be humble. We know very little. And so, this is the frame. The relevance is there. The point was that the way of thinking in this world of the ancient Near Eastern text was by association. If an idea came into your head, if a feeling, you felt something, and the next moment you felt something else, or you said something else, or you did something, they were connected. In other words, there may be something that we're not catching. And when you read the anthropology book, which I suggest to you over and over again to take an Eitzah, it's online now, the entire book was put online, You can read it right off the line, and you can copy it down free. Pedersen, Johannes Pedersen, a Danish scholar from 1926, wrote a book called Israel, Its Life and Culture. It's an anthropological entry into the Chumash and prophetic world from the point of view, or let's put it this way, where he grasped the non-Greek understanding of the soul, of the neshama, of the way of thinking. And he says many times, you read it for yourself, he says many times, you as the reader may not understand what I'm talking about, because you're not thinking in association terms. You're thinking in terms of propositions. You're thinking in terms of statements. I'm sure they connect, but they also connect by logic, not necessarily by association. But here we're talking about how the child learns. Why did I mention the child? Because the child is an example par excellence of all the things I'm saying tonight. And so, he points out, he has to point out to the reader, you have to get your own language. To catch what I'm talking about, you have to resonate, you have to feel it, you have to hear the music. And we use words like association and so on. In Western philosophy, who was the closest? David Hume, the Englishman, who Kant says woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. But before Kant, there was first Hobbes and then Locke, Rousseau, and as part of that whole orientation was this, what was I saying? Was David Hume. He was a historian, a writer, and so on. He wrote a number of books, and he's essential for any philosophy person. They have a course on Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Locke, the great John Locke, and Berkeley, who was the guy who said that if a tree falls in the forest, does it fall or not? When it's not perceived, he was a bishop, and Hume. That was the course. In Harvard, they had these threesomes. You know, that was the way they organized. They had philosophy 101, but then they had, like Spinoza, Descartes, Leibniz. 3 17th century thinkers. Okay? Spinoza, Descartes, Leibniz. Okay, that's how it was. Peirce, James, and Dewey. That was the course. They put 3 philosophers together. Okay, so you learn, or you took your choice. I did many times when I studied the one on Peirce. He was so difficult that yours truly just studied James and Dewey and forgot about Peirce. And until recently, when it's been come back, because one of the guys here wrote a master's thesis on Peirce, and he gave it to me to read, and my eyes were open, because it's for the first time I understood the hell he's talking about. Whereas before in the course, if I took Peirce, I would have flunked the course. And it had a fear in people. Most people were like me. He was the most original American philosopher, left 80,000 pages in manuscript. Had to burn his paper to keep warm in the winter. The biggest Chillul Hashem in American intellectual history. But anyway, the point was, here was this thinking by association. And to end the story for this evening, one of the books I wrote came out of, or used a method of saying, capture your stream of consciousness immediately. As soon as you read something, don't stop. Don't stop to write. Or stop to write. But write what came into your mind. I saw a red bird flying yesterday. Put it down. Put it down. What is that? What is that? That's an example of association. We would say, well, this Meshiga. If you take him seriously, well, they put you in the booby hatch. Because if you see a red bird today and a blue bird tomorrow and a dove the next day and so on, well, now you're schizophrenic and we got to put you away. But the point is, in this orientation, knowledge, understanding, relationships develop by association, not by logic, not by drawing implications from a sentence. All men are mortal. It's a sentence, a proposition, right? So this guy is mortal. That's a proposition and an inference from the proposition. Okay? But association is psychological in the main, and it doesn't take the form of sentences, of propositions. For example, if you, in a personal way, you say, my name is Joe, and you're making it as a performative. Maybe you're saying, call me Joe. I don't answer to anything else. Call me Joe. It happens to be the case that with every performative that's made, especially self-identity performatives, okay, with my name, with that goes a package of associations. So, it's not a package of sentences. It's a few words. Tall, big guy, red. Oh, that's him. Those are words. They're not sentences. You could say, well, grammatically implicit, there's a subject and a predicate. That's taking the whole thing and putting it onto a different paradigm. Association, I mean, feelings associate. And so, language associates, and so Pedersen says, in my book, if you want to understand ancient Near Eastern text in the way they thought, realize that they thought in terms of associations. And so, part of the search for vestiges includes all the points I mentioned, in addition to which there's a primacy, or at least David pointed out the last time, that at least a co-equality between assertions, sentences, propositions, and performatives. But certainly it was a world of performatives. And so I leave you with the following thought. Here's a thing called the mun, okay? In the text, it was reworked by Moshe. It was reworked linguistically to be called manhu. What is it? There was a linguistic reconstruction. There was an immersion of the thing in the Shabbat. And in addition, for whatever the reason, whether Moshe chose to do it or didn't chose to do it, there is a description of the man from the point of view of the practical, of the maaseh. How do you eat it? You can't eat it, take it off the ground. It's too hard. So you have all of this thing, and so you have the relevance of a anthropological approach. Indeed, again from Google, you can pass it around. There were a couple of guys who discovered, it's not the first time I read it, but there were a couple of guys who discovered that the description of the man matches the description in the ancient world, and today, when you look up the encyclopedia, okay, you look at an encyclopedia article on the man, it says, well, hey, first of all, they had a few animals that were part of the settlement in the Midbar. It wasn't that they had animal free. Well, there was defecation from animals that was fertilizer. Okay? It talks about the mun coming up with a dew. So the dew had certain properties. And they give you a contemporary picture when they're writing a book. Of course, he's interested in the mun, but if he's a herbologist and so forth, he's interested in what this was all about. I learned, for example, there was a preservative. Honey was a preservative in the ancient world, especially of these kinds of things. Well, okay, now you could say, look, you learned something. I'm an ignoramus. What do I know? Okay, well, yes, on the individual level, that's a learning. I learned it, and therefore I could use it. I could teach it. I could relate to it. We could have a discussion about it, and blah, 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 blah. But somebody else, it resonates not like that. It resonates biochemically. If honey was a preservative, what exactly in the honey? You could say, take your jar of honey over here and say that's a preservative. I mean, well, it does is mess up your hands, mess up the tablecloth. I mean,
Locks out the air.
Whatever. But the point is, I'm only indicating on the personal level, it's fantastic. I mean, it's getting a new education, picking up things, information points and things that are valuable to me to understand the text. And on the bigger scale, for Western civilization to realize that maybe we don't know everything. We got a lot to learn. When I learned Chumash and learned in general, I had a very truncated view of the ancient world. I took it for granted they were like there were settlements, and there were people, and then there was wide open spaces. Not true at all. Not true at all. There were kingships that spanned east and west, north and south. There were distances that were covered that are staggering. There were kingships, wars, natural occurrences of plagues and so on that took centuries for them to come to fruition. There were things that were going on that were not in awareness. They didn't register in the awareness of the people, but they were going on until some point where either they got lost, they dissolved out, or they became recognized. Now these are assumptions. I always say, what do you mean not recognized? What do you mean something is working and it's not registered in your head what's going on? What do you mean? So I said, Greg, in addition to feeding, look at the child. Look at the child from birth. How are we going to do that? First, in the ancient world, in antiquity, and we are late when it comes to antiquity. We came into the scene 6,000 years ago. The agricultural revolution took place about 10 to 12,000 BC. And so, realize, the first move is, to enter anthropologically is, you must think in long time scales. 10,000 years. You know what 10,000 years? You just think it's just a number. 10,000 years. It's 300 years since Newton and the scientific revolution. Okay? 300 years. How many times? 300 times 30. Right? 300 times 30 gives you 9,000, 10,000 years. So it's 300 times more. First thing to understand is you must enter with a wide time scale. And further, you've got to realize that I'm just talking about